somewhere on the Eastern Front, autumn 1941. A German infantry company has just overrun a Soviet position after a bitter firefight. The men sweep through the trench line collecting weapons, checking bodies, looking for anything useful. One soldier stops at a piece of equipment that looks, at first assessment, like a crude and ungainly tube sitting on a round steel plate with two legs. It weighs 56 kilograms in 3 pieces. It has no breech mechanism. It has no complex sighting system. It fires by dropping a round down the barrel and letting gravity complete the job. A trained crew can put 25 to 30 rounds per minute on a target 3 kilometers away. The company commander looks at it. He has a German 8cm Granatwerfer 34, the Wehrmacht's standard battalion mortar. It is an excellent weapon. It is also, at this moment, in need of ammunition that his supply chain might not deliver for days. He looks at the captured Soviet ammunition stacked near the Soviet position, 82 MEM rounds, slightly wider than his own, but the same basic design principle. He knows, because German infantry have been learning this fact with gathering frequency since June, that his own mortar's barrel is 81 millimeters wide and the Soviet rounds are 82 millimeters. His rounds will not fit down the Soviet tube, but Soviet rounds, being 1 millimeter smaller, will fit into his tube. He is standing next to a weapon that was specifically engineered to ensure this asymmetry, and he is on the wrong side of it. His unit logs the captured mortar as equipment taken in action. His battalion headquarters redesignates it the 8.2 cm Granatwerfer 274/R. He keeps it. This is the story of the Soviet 82 ME mortar series, the 82 BM37, the 82 PM41, and the 82 PM43, and of how a weapon dismissed by its opponents as heavy, clumsy, and technologically unimpressive turned out to contain one of the most elegant pieces of deliberate tactical engineering in the Second World War. The mortar's origins are straightforward and honest. The Soviet Union copied the French. The Brandt May 2731, designed by Edgar Brandt and adopted by the French army in the early 1930s, was the finest infantry mortar of its generation. It established the 3-component design that all subsequent military mortars inherited: a barrel, a bipod, and a base plate, and it did so with an elegance that made the physics obvious once you saw it. A mortar shell dropped fin first down a tube strikes a fixed firing pin at the bottom, igniting a propellant charge in the tail assembly, and the expanding gas drives the shell out the muzzle at whatever angle the barrel is set. The elevation changes the range. The traverse adjusts the direction. There are no moving parts in the firing cycle. The weapon cannot misfire in the way a bolt-action rifle or a semi-automatic pistol can misfire, because there is no mechanical firing cycle to fail. You drop the round, it fires. The only catastrophic failure mode is dropping a second round before the first has cleared the tube, which is why Soviet designers eventually incorporated a safety device preventing exactly that. The French Brandt was 81 mm in caliber. The Soviet engineers who received samples and studied them in the early 1930s noticed, recognized, and deliberately changed one dimension. Their version would be 82 mm. The Wikipedia article on the 82 BM37 states this design intention precisely. It was designed to be able to fire Western 81 EMEA captured ammunition whilst not permitting the enemy the same advantage. The Dunkirk, 1940. Org analysis of a captured German Granatwerfer 34 found in Soviet hands after the war elaborates on the physics. Soviet rounds were in fact 81 mine, with an additional thin layer of lubrication applied, allowing them to be used in the German 81A mine barrel. The reverse was impossible. A German 81 mm round dropped into an 82 mm Soviet tube would fit loosely, with propellant gas escaping around the projectile's fins, reducing velocity, degrading accuracy, and making the weapon unpredictable. This single millimeter difference was not an accident of manufacturing tolerance. It was a considered asymmetry engineered into the Soviet mortar from the outset, providing Soviet forces with the ability to use captured German ammunition in their own weapons while ensuring German forces could not productively use captured Soviet ammunition in theirs. That German commanders nonetheless found the Soviet mortar worth capturing and keeping, despite needing to source its specific ammunition rather than repurposing their own existing stock, is the clearest measure of how much better the Soviet weapon was than its German equivalent in the characteristics that matter most on the Eastern Front. The man responsible for the 82 BM-37 was Boris Ivanovich Shavarin, born in Yaroslavl in 1902, the son of a railway worker who wanted his son to follow him onto the Volga steamers or the railway network. Shavarin chose neither path. After the revolution, he trained as an engineer, and by the mid-1930s he had been drawn into the Soviet Union's systematic program to develop mortars across every caliber from 50 mm to 240 mm. His early work was based explicitly on studying the French Brandt designs, but his approach to adapting foreign technology was not imitation for its own sake. It was improvement within the constraints of Soviet manufacturing and operational reality. The Global Security Org biography of Shavarin notes that after the first use of his mortars in combat at Khalkhin Gol in August 1939, a government decree was issued increasing mortar production, and work on mortar development in other design bureaux expanded simultaneously. In April 1942, Shavarin was appointed chief and chief designer of the newly created Special Design Bureau that he headed until his death in 1965. The KBM, as it became known, eventually produced more than 80% of all mortar types in the Soviet Union. The 82 BM-36, Shavarin's first 82E main design, was essentially the French Brandt recalibrated to 82E main with a square baseplate. It weighed 62 kilograms and had a range of approximately 3,000 meters. The 82 BM-37, accepted into service in 1937, was his first significant departure from the Brandt template. The baseplate changed from rectangular to round, a change whose significance is not immediately obvious until you consider what a mortar crew does between shots. After each round, the pressure of firing drives the baseplate into the earth and can shift the barrel's orientation slightly. With a rectangular plate, correcting the shift requires lifting the entire assembly and reseating it. With a circular plate, the crew can rotate the bipod in any direction while keeping the plate in the ground, adjusting aim without repositioning the base plate. This reduces the time between aimed shots and decreases the fatigue of the crew over a sustained fire mission. Shavarin also introduced recoil, absorbing springs between the barrel and the bipod, reducing the shock transmitted to the bipod's feet on firing and further decreasing the need to relay the weapon after each round. The replica weapons. Com documentation of the 82 BM-37 specifications notes these springs were described as blowback damping improvements that made the new mortar 8 kilograms lighter than its predecessor, while being significantly more stable in sustained fire. The resulting weapon weighed 56 kilograms complete, had a barrel 1.22 meters long, and could deliver a 3.05 kilogram shell to a maximum range of 3,040 meters at a rate of 25 to 30 rounds per minute with a trained crew. At 25 rounds per minute, that is a 3 kilogram high explosive shell landing somewhere in a target area every 2.4 seconds. A German Granatwerfer 34 produced similar performance on paper, 81 mm caliber, comparable range, comparable rate of fire, but the Soviet weapon's circular baseplate and spring-dampened bipod gave it operational advantages that paper specifications did not capture. The German mortar required more frequent repositioning during sustained fire. The Soviet mortar stayed on target longer. Before getting into the specific campaign history that transformed the 82 BM mortar from a battalion weapon into the backbone of Soviet infantry fire support, and the documented German response that confirms the title's claim precisely, if the level of technical and historical depth in this channel is what keeps you watching, subscribe now. It costs nothing and makes more content like this possible. Let's talk about what happened when the weapons met on the Eastern Front. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, and within the first weeks captured an extraordinary quantity of Soviet military equipment. The speed of the German advance in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa overran Soviet positions before many units could withdraw or destroy their weapons. The national interest analysis of Soviet mortar use in the war notes that large stocks of the 82 PM-36 and improved 82 PM-37 were captured or destroyed during the rapid German advance. The Germans found themselves in possession of hundreds of functional Soviet mortars with substantial ammunition stocks, and German logistics units were noting a practical problem. The German Army's own mortar, the 8cm Granatwerfer 34, was an outstanding weapon but could not use the captured Soviet. Ammunition. The Soviet mortar could use German ammunition. Captured Soviet mortars therefore provided German infantry units with a mortar capability that ran on whatever ammunition was closest, their own German 81 mm rounds or the captured Soviet 82 mm stock. The formal German recognition of the captured weapons produced three separate designation codes: 8.2 cm Granatwerfer 274R for the Soviet M36, 8 Downs 2 cm Granatwerfer 274/2R for the M37, and 8.2 cm Granatwerfer 274-3R for the subsequent M41. The R suffix indicated Russische Boyjet, Russian captured equipment, a designation system the Wehrmacht applied to all captured Soviet weapons that were formally adopted for service rather than merely used opportunistically. The military factory. Com documentation of the M37 confirms that all three variants entered formal German service under these designations. This was not ad hoc scavenging by individual soldiers in desperate situations. It was institutional adoption, with supply chain support for the specific ammunition. Formal issuance tables and unit records. The weaponsystems.net technical analysis of the 82 MEM BM37 family makes a point that sharpens the picture considerably. The BM41 and BM43 variants, developed to improve mobility, proved to be disappointing, and production eventually switched back to a reduced weight version of the BM37. The BM41 had a removable wheeled base that made it easier to transport but made it less stable during firing and gave it a worse center of gravity in the shooting position. The Wikipedia article on the 82 PM41 confirms this directly. The 82 Mortar Model 1941 was more convenient to transport than the Model 1937, but was less steady during firing and had a worse center of gravity. To correct shortcomings of the 82 ME Mortar Model 1941, it was modernized during initial production, and due to the initial need to rectify design issues, 1937 model mortars continued to be used during World War II and produced alongside models 1941 and 1943. This matters because it demonstrates that the Soviet mortar's evolution during the war was driven by the specific priorities of the Eastern Front rather than by abstract engineering improvement. Mobility was desirable, stability was indispensable. When the two came into tension, the Soviets reverted to the design that was harder to move and easier to fire accurately. The BM37 in its revised form, lighter than the original, with simplified sights and a double loading safety device added in the modernized M37M variant, was the version that German units wanted most: robust, reliable, and accurate in the sustained fire role that infantry support required. The production statistics for the Soviet mortar program between 1941 and 1945 reflect the weapon's importance to Soviet infantry doctrine in numbers that dwarf every comparable effort by any other belligerent. The Top War. RU analysis of Soviet mortar production in the war period documents that the USSR manufactured 347,900 mortars of all types from July 1941 to June 1945, an average of 86,975 per year. For context, the United States produced 110,000 mortars across the entire war period from 1940 to 1945. Britain produced 96,000 in 1939 to 1944. Germany produced 68,000 in 1941 to 1944. The Soviet Union produced more than 5 times Germany's entire mortar output in the same period in roughly the same time frame. These numbers reflect a doctrinal commitment that went beyond procurement. By the time of the German invasion in June 1941, each Soviet infantry division contained 84 50 mm mortars. Within 3 years, the 50 mm mortar had been completely withdrawn from service, not because it failed, but because experience had demonstrated that the 82 mm was so superior in hitting power that the smaller weapon was redundant. The National Interest Analysis notes this substitution explicitly. The 50 mm mortar lacked hitting power and was replaced by a series of 82 mm mortars. Each Red Army Rifle Regiment received a mortar company equipped with 82 mm weapons. Each battalion received a mortar platoon. The weapon that had been a useful supplementary tool in 1941 had become, by 1943, the primary close support fire system for Soviet infantry at every level below the division. The comparison with the German Granatwerfer 34 that the Soviets faced most frequently illuminates the Soviet mortar's specific tactical advantages beyond the ammunition asymmetry. The Dunkirk, 1940. Org analysis of a German Granatwerfer 34 found in Soviet hands includes a detail that reveals how closely opposing sides studied each other's weapons. The Soviets were unimpressed with the accuracy of the German mortar. The German barrel was 1.14 meters long, the Soviet barrel was 1.22 meters. A longer barrel gives a projectile more time to be guided by the rifling or the bore, produces more consistent muzzle velocities, and reduces the spread of rounds at a given range setting. Soviet infantrymen and their German counterparts both noticed this difference. Soviet mortars consistently produced tighter groups at their effective ranges. German units that captured Soviet mortars and used them reported the accuracy advantage directly in after-action records. The Finnish experience with Soviet 82 mm mortars adds another perspective on how the weapon was perceived by opponents who had time to study it carefully. The Jaeger platoon. Net Finnish military history documentation of 82 mm mortars confirms that the Finnish army captured 78 Soviet 82 mm mortars by June 1940, at the end of the Winter War, with an additional 405 captured during the continuation war of 1941 to 1944. Finnish forces repaired damaged captured specimens and put them into service. The total, 493 captured Soviet 82 ME mortars, represented a significant portion of Finnish indirect fire capability at the battalion level. Finland was not fighting a desperate defensive battle using inadequate weapons. It was choosing to use captured Soviet mortars because they were good weapons worth the logistical effort of supporting separately from Finnish standard equipment. The Soviet mortar's combat record across the major battles of the Eastern Front is inseparable from the nature of the fighting itself. Mortar fire is indirect. The crew cannot see their target directly. They receive coordinates, elevate and traverse their tube to match those coordinates, and fire. The weapon's effectiveness depends entirely on the quality of observer reports, the accuracy of coordinate transmission, and the stability of the weapon between shots. On the Eastern Front, where the distances between infantry lines were often measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers, and where the compressed geography of Stalingrad reduced effective combat ranges to tens of meters. The 82 mm mortar occupied the precise tactical space that no other weapon could fill, capable enough to be lethal at up to 3 kilometers, light enough to be carried by 3 or 4 men, simple enough to operate under any conditions that human beings could survive in. Stalingrad is the battle where Soviet mortar doctrine reached its most extreme expression. General Chuikov's storm group tactics, described in the Soviet grenade script in this series, depended on the mortar as the primary indirect fire support element for units operating in buildings where artillery could not be aimed closely enough without risk to friendly forces. The 82 mm mortar, set at high elevation angles and with carefully adjusted charges, could loft rounds onto rooftops, into courtyards, and through upper floor windows from positions only a few hundred meters away. The accounts from Soviet veterans of Stalingrad consistently describe mortar fire as the equalizer in building-to-building fighting, the weapon that could reach German positions inside structures that direct fire from rifles and machine guns could not address. Kursk in July 1943 produced the 82 mm mortar's most documented anti-armor application, not killing tanks directly, but targeting the infantry that accompanied them. German tank assault doctrine in 1943 required infantry to walk with the armor and protect it from Soviet anti-tank teams that would otherwise close-to-close range with RPG-40 grenades or petard anti-tank rifles. Soviet defensive positions placed 82 EME mortars pre-ranged on the routes of advance. As German armored formations moved forward, mortar crews began working methodically through their fire plans, dropping rounds not on the tanks, against which 82 EME shells were generally ineffective, but on the infantry walking beside them. Strip the infantry away, and the tanks were vulnerable to everything the Soviet defensive system had prepared. The Battle of Kursk involved the most heavily mined terrain in history, but it was the combination of mines and mortar fire on exposed infantry that made the mine threat decisive. The German response to the Soviet mortar program reveals how seriously the threat was taken at the institutional level. German commanders on the Eastern Front repeatedly requested heavier organic mortar support for their infantry formations, and the Wehrmacht developed the 8 cm Granatwerfer 34 variants and the 12 cm Granatwerfer 42 specifically in response to what they experienced against Soviet mortar fire. The Granatwerfer 42 itself is the most explicit evidence of German respect for Soviet mortar design. The Wikipedia article on the weapon states directly, this weapon was very similar to the M1938 mortar used by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, which in turn was an improved version of the French 120 Aim Brentley 1935 mortar. The German army had encountered the Soviet 120 mm mortar in large quantities during Barbarossa, designated it the 12 cm Granatwerfer 378R, put the captured weapons into service, and then produced a German copy, the Granatwerfer 42, which was subsequently widely issued to German units and often took the place of infantry guns later in the war. Germany had reverse-engineered Soviet mortar doctrine into its own equipment program, producing 5,373,000 rounds of ammunition for the 12 cm weapon. The 82 EME mortar program received the same treatment at the battalion level. The 2 cm Gura W274 series designations across 3 Soviet mortar variants represent not the opportunistic scavenging of desperate units, but the deliberate institutional adoption of captured weapons that German commanders considered superior to their own in specific tactical roles. The formal designation under the German Grau equivalent cataloging system, complete with variant numbers distinguishing the 1936, 1937, and 1941 Soviet models, indicates systematic supply chain support, training manuals, and tactical integration rather than improvised use. The cost comparison that underlies all of this is where the Soviet mortar's production logic becomes most clearly visible. A Soviet 82 AME mortar in its BM-37 form cost approximately the same as a standard infantry rifle platoon's worth of small arms, was produced using relatively simple manufacturing processes that could be distributed across facilities that were not primary arms plants, and required no precision manufacturing except for the barrel and sighting elements. The shell, a 3.05 kilogram high explosive round that cost a fraction of an artillery shell of comparable effect, could be produced in ammunition factories across the Soviet Union's dispersed industrial base. The Top War. RU analysis specifically notes that mass production and decentralized manufacture ensured enormous availability even after the catastrophic losses of 1941's opening months. The 8 cm Granatwerfer 34 that German infantry carried was by most technical measures a superior weapon to the Soviet BM-36 it encountered in 1941. It was more precise in its sighting system, lighter in some configurations, and built to German manufacturing standards that the early Soviet designs did not always match. What the German weapon could not do was fire Soviet ammunition, be mass-produced at the same scale, or benefit from the same doctrinal commitment that placed a mortar platoon in every rifle battalion of the Red Army by the middle of the war. The final measure of the 82 ME mortar's success is not the weapons it destroyed or the battles it influenced, though those are documented in the records of every campaign on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945. The final measure is that the weapon is still in production. The 82 BM-37 entered service in 1937. The Wikipedia article on the weapon lists its service history as 1937 to present. The same round baseplate, the same spring-dampened bipod, the same drop-fire mechanism that Boris Chavarin derived from studying a French design and improved by changing one key dimension. It served in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Rhodesian Bush War, the Portuguese Colonial War, Afghanistan, the Gulf War, the Syrian Civil War, and the Russo-Ukrainian War. When the TopWar.ru analysis compared Allied and Soviet mortar production totals, it noted that Soviet forces produced more mortars in 4 years than the United States, Britain, and Germany combined. The weapon those mortars armed has been in continuous service longer than any other mortar system in the world. Returned to that company commander in autumn 1941. The captured Soviet mortar beside the overrun position. The decision to log it, designate it, and keep it. He has no way of knowing that his army will spend the next 4 years fighting against the same basic weapon in increasing numbers. He has no way of knowing that the Wehrmacht will eventually produce its own version of the Soviet 120 EME mortar, because what started as enemy equipment became evidence of a better solution. He has no way of knowing that the weapon in front of him, dismissed by every pre-war assessment as a clumsy copy of a French design, will outlast the army that captured it by 8 decades and counting. What he knows is that it fires reliably, that it is sitting next to a stack of ammunition his own mortar cannot use, and that his men need indirect fire support. He keeps it. The Soviet mortar was not clumsy. It was designed by a man who understood what clumsiness meant in manufacturing, what it meant in the field, and what 1 millimeter of caliber difference meant when the wrong army was doing the carrying.